The sun over Red Mesa, Arizona territory, in the summer of 1883 was less a light source and more a forge. It beat down on the San Juan desert edge, turning the dust to a fine, shimmering red flour that coated everything: the tin roof of the schoolhouse, the rough-hewn timbers of the Yellow Cactus Saloon, and the freshly laid tracks of the advancing railway. The town itself seemed to cling to life only because of the defiant, towering red rock mesas that framed it, looking less like scenery and more like enormous, sun-baked prison walls. Evelyn Hart, 23 years old, stepped out onto the porch of the small wooden church and immediately tasted the dust. It was the taste of Red Mesa, dry and uncompromising. She tightened the collar of her simple gray dress, a modest but sturdy garment she had brought all the way from the humid, forgiving green of Missouri. Evelyn was new here, having arrived 3 months ago to take up the post of schoolteacher, and she was discovering that principle and compassion, while necessary, did not hold up well against the pervasive realities of the frontier. She carried a quiet maturity, the kind that came from early responsibility, but beneath her strict adherence to schedule and rule, she was deeply shy about matters of the heart, a nervousness she kept fiercely hidden. Her little schoolhouse, a single room with a temperamental wood stove and a roof that rattled in the wind, sat near the edge of town, dangerously close to the last dependable surface water spring. That proximity was the root of her current troubles. And the owner of those troubles was Silas Crowley. Crowley was not just the biggest rancher in the county, commanding thousands of acres and head of cattle. He also held the title of acting justice of the peace. He was a man who used law like a heavy hammer, and he intended to use it now to finish what he had started: monopolizing the area's grazing land and, crucially, the water. Crowley had recently invoked the barbed wire law, a brutal regulation designed to allow large landholders to fence off communal grazing areas. His ambition now focused on the small cluster of properties near the water source, and the school lot was his primary target. Evelyn knew the pressure was mounting. Crowley, through threats to cut credit at the general store and whispers spread by his loyal, thuggish men, a group known locally and ominously as the Crows, was stirring the townsfolk. He had even managed to sway Reverend Hale at the church, who had begun hinting in sermons that Evelyn's independent spirit and her refusal to conform to the town council's dictates about the school's curriculum might be bringing divine displeasure upon their dry land. "It's not just a school," Evelyn murmured to herself, watching the heat ripple off the main street. "It's the last piece of ground they haven't managed to sell to fear." In Red Mesa, the law was dust. Everyone who coughed must swallow it, and Evelyn had decided she would not cough. Her commitment to keeping the school open, and, by extension, her own free life, had become an act of civic defiance. The stillness of the afternoon was shattered by a commotion far louder than the usual saloon brawl. A heavy, armored stagecoach, the weekly mail and remittance wagon, the town's only real link to the outside world, came tearing into the street. It was listing wildly. One of the outriders was missing, and the driver was clinging desperately to the reins, his face a mask of terror. Following close behind were 3 riders wearing bandanas pulled high over their noses, their movements calculated and brutal. These were the Crows, and this was no random attack. It was Crowley's setup, designed to frighten the town and, more importantly, to pin the blame on any drifting scoundrel who happened to be nearby. As the stage rattled past the Yellow Cactus, one of the masked riders fired a shot toward the sky. A clear signal, and the stage lurched. A small boy, Noah, about 8 years old, who had been watching from the feed store porch, froze in terror. The sudden noise spooked a tethered workhorse nearby. The horse reared, snapped its bridle, and bolted, charging down the street directly toward the terrified child. Chaos erupted. People dove for cover. The Crows were too focused on the mail to care about a child. The stage driver couldn't stop, and Noah was paralyzed. Then, a blur of movement from the edge of town, near the livery stable. Boone Calder, 29, was not looking for trouble, but trouble, as it often did with men who preferred quiet honesty to loud lies. seemed to find him. He was a drover, or cowhand, hardened by years on the trail, moving cattle from Texas to railheads in Kansas, and his clothes carried the scent of sweat, leather, and smoke. His face was a study in rough-hewn angles, his eyes a steady, calm blue, and his movements were deliberate, economical. He had stopped in Red Mesa only to get a replacement stirrup and let his horse, a sturdy bay named Scout, rest before hitting the trail again. He saw the stage, the bandits, and the charging horse. He didn't hesitate. With a powerful shout that cut through the noise, Boone spurred Scout into a hard gallop. He didn't draw a pistol on the crows. His quarrel wasn't with them yet, and he hated unnecessary killing. Instead, he pulled the heavy Winchester repeater from his saddle sheath, aimed it high, and fired 2 rapid shots that whistled into the red rock face of the nearest mesa, scattering stone shrapnel and producing an echo that sounded like the end of the world. The crows, surprised by the sudden, accurate firing from an unknown source, broke formation. The distraction was enough. Boone didn't stop to fight them. He swerved his horse, leaning low over Scout's neck, and galloped directly between the runaway horse and Noah. With practiced speed, he dropped the Winchester, yanked his lasso from the saddle horn, and cast it forward. The loop settled perfectly over the neck of the charging animal. The jerk almost tore Boone from his saddle. He dug his boots into the stirrups and leaned back, his body a counterweight. Using Scout's momentum to check the horse's run, the rope hummed taut, friction smoking against the saddle horn. The runaway stumbled, yanked hard, and finally stopped about 20 feet from the frozen boy, snorting steam and dust. The crows, seeing their staged robbery unravel, exchanged panicked shouts. One of them, a man Evelyn recognized as Silas Crowley's foreman, Murdoch, fired a wild shot that went wide. Boone, already backing off and coiling his rope, didn't return fire. He glanced once at the stage, now momentarily stalled, and then back at the boy. His work was done. Evelyn, shaken but instantly professional, had rushed from the church porch the moment the horse stopped. She reached Noah, whose face was streaked with tears and red dust, and pulled him fiercely into the relative safety of the nearest wooden porch, the one belonging to the general store. The street was still full of confusion. The crows, realizing the element of surprise was lost and the mail was secure for the moment, wheeled their horses and galloped out of town, kicking up a final curtain of red dust. Boone, a picture of calm efficiency amidst the receding chaos, untied the runaway horse and handed the reins to a bewildered shopkeeper, all without dismounting. He was a big man, filling the saddle, his movements precise, almost slow. His dark leather gloves, heavy with trail wear, contrasted with the clean, dark gray wool of his hat, which was pulled low, shadowing his eyes. He began to ride slowly past the store porch where Evelyn held Noah, who was now clinging to her skirts. The late afternoon sun caught the rim of Boone's hat, throwing his face into shadow and etching the powerful line of his jaw. Evelyn, still breathing hard, watched him pass. He was a complete stranger, a drifter, a cowboy, someone who by Red Mesa standards should have been running from the gunfire, not riding into it. "Sir," Evelyn called out, her voice surprisingly steady despite the rapid drumming in her chest. Boone Calder stopped Scout, but he did not turn his body, only shifted his weight and inclined his head. Waiting. Evelyn swallowed the knot in her throat. She gripped Noah a little tighter, feeling the boy's slight weight, and the words came out with the simple, sincere honesty that was her deepest nature. I just wanted to say, it's something, a stranger, just passing through, suddenly braved a hail of bullets for a child he didn't know." Boone turned his head fully then, his eyes meeting hers a startling, clear blue against the dust and the shadow. Evelyn was struck by the absence of swagger, the lack of any expectation of praise. His expression was flat, almost curt, but entirely without malice. He didn't speak of bullets, courage, or the bandits. He only offered a short, direct observation, his voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. Because he is a person. And with that, Boone gave a gentle nudge to Scout and rode on, heading toward the western edge of town, leaving Evelyn standing on the porch, holding the boy with that short sentence echoing in her mind. Because he is a person. In a town where people were categorized by their land deeds, their debts, or their church attendance. This was a profoundly simple, unsettling piece of philosophy. Silas Crowley was not pleased. The robbery, designed to be swift, brutal, and blamed entirely on itinerant scum to justify a local crackdown, had been ruined. Now, the story circulating through the Yellow Cactus Saloon wasn't about the dangers of drifters. It was about the quick, clean action of one particular cowboy. Crowley sat in his makeshift office next to the land registry, a tall, stern man in a surprisingly clean suit. Even in the Red Mesa heat, he had the cold, calculating look of a man who saw water as currency and people as obstacles. "Murdoch, you fool!" Crowley hissed, adjusting the pince-nez glasses on his nose. "You let a common drover shoot the dust off your boots and save the boy. Now the townsfolk are talking about a hero, not a threat." Murdoch, a thick-necked man with the greasy look of a vulture, shifted his weight uncomfortably. "He's fast, Judge, faster than I saw coming, but he didn't stick around. He's probably halfway to Silverton by now." "He's still in town," Crowley corrected, his voice dangerously smooth. "He was seen at May Alvarez's stable, and he is a complication I cannot afford, not with the auction coming up." The auction was the final play. Crowley intended to use his authority to condemn the school's land, citing vague safety concerns and the supposed debt owed by the town council, and then buy it at a fraction of its worth. The land was crucial because it offered the straightest path to the only clean spring left outside his massive property lines. Control the spring. Control Red Mesa. "I want the pressure applied immediately." Crowley commanded, "Start with the teacher, Evelyn Hart. She's the symbol. Break the symbol. The town sells out." The pressure on Evelyn was already beginning to feel like a physical weight. The day after the stagecoach incident, old Mr. Hemlock, who supplied the school with firewood on credit, had suddenly developed an inventory problem and stopped delivery. Later that morning, Reverend Hale, a kindly man with a spine of oatmeal, stopped her on the street, his brow furrowed with genuine distress. "Miss Hart," he began, fidgeting with the lapel of his black coat. "The town council and Judge Crowley, they feel that your continued presence near the creek area is creating tension, and your decision to open classes to the children of the Mexican railroad workers and the Navajo families, well, it is stirring up controversy." "Reverend," Evelyn said, keeping her voice even. "The school charter says all children of the community, and as for tension, the only tension is being applied by the barbed wire Crowley has begun stringing up near the public access trail." The Reverend looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "We all need the water, Miss Hart, and Judge Crowley holds the credit line for most of us, perhaps a sabbatical, just until the land issue is resolved." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained low. "I came here to teach. Reverend, my class is not an inconvenience to be resolved, and my presence is not dependent on the judge's goodwill. I will not abandon my class, and I will not relinquish my freedom to teach based on the color of a child's skin or the thickness of his father's wallet." Later that afternoon, Evelyn was at the schoolhouse, trying to shore up a loose section of the tin roof before the next inevitable windstorm. She looked at the cracked, dry earth around the small building and felt the desperation of the town. Without that spring, and without the public right-of-way, the town would wither into nothing but a Crowley outpost. The school had become more than a classroom. It was the only neutral territory left, a fragile, tin-roofed testament to community that stood right in the crosshairs of Crowley's greed. As she struggled with a warped plank, Boone Calder rode into her line of sight. He had staked his horse, Scout, in the small, dusty corral behind May Alvarez's yellow cactus, and he was walking slowly toward the feed store with a coil of fresh rope over his shoulder. He looked like a man determined to mind his own business, but the townsfolk kept their distance, whispering about the rapid gunshots from the day before. He was the kind of complication Red Mesa rarely saw a man of clear, sudden action, yet lacking the usual mercenary motive. Evelyn watched him pass, remembering his curt reply. Because he is a person, it was a stark contrast to the self-serving chatter that dominated Red Mesa. Boone, sensing her gaze, paused near the fence line. He looked at the schoolhouse, at the rattling tin roof, and then at Evelyn, who was trying and failing to hammer a nail into a weathered piece of wood without bending it. "You're going to break that hammerhead, ma'am," Boone called out, his voice carrying easily in the dry air. Evelyn stopped, sighing slightly. She didn't often appreciate unsolicited advice, but this was probably true. "I'm aware," she replied, trying to sound dignified while covered in red dust. "But I've found that determination can sometimes compensate for lack of aptitude." Boone chuckled, a surprisingly warm sound. He leaned against the fence, his dark hat shadowing his expression. "In this country, determination just means you get to fail more times before you quit. You need leverage, not grit, for that kind of repair." "I am not quitting, Mr. Calder, Boone Calder, and Mr. Calder, and I am not quitting, nor am I leaving Red Mesa." Boone pushed himself off the fence. "A principled stand will always get you a broken hammer, Miss Hart. You want that fixed?" "I want to keep the whole school from being fenced in and sold," Evelyn retorted, unable to hide the frustration in her tone. Boone looked at the dry, valuable land, the spring not far beyond the school lot. He already knew about Crowley and the barbed wire. The kind of fight Evelyn was in was the kind Boone had run from before, a slow, grinding injustice that turned good men bad. "The roof first," Boone said, walking toward her. He took the hammer from her hand, his calloused fingers brushing hers, a brief, startling contact that sent a quick warmth through her. "You can't save the world with a leaky schoolhouse, and I'm not running from this particular bit of trouble yet." He looked back at the main street, where a sign, hastily plastered to the post office wall, was already fluttering in the wind. It was a poorly drawn wanted poster, offering a reward for information leading to the arrest of the stagecoach robbers, with a crude description that ended with, "Dark hat, excellent marksman, riding a bay, presumed to be a drifter or outlaw." The description was close enough to fit almost any cowhand, but it was specifically engineered to point at Boone. Boone smiled, not a soft smile, but a thin, wry twist of the lips. "In Red Mesa," he said, handing the hammer back, "handle first, to Evelyn. The law is dust, everyone who coughs must swallow it. You just need to make sure you're the one kicking up the cloud." He retrieved a heavy coil of rope he'd brought for another purpose and, without asking, began to climb the wall of the schoolhouse, moving with the same quiet competence he had shown rescuing Noah. He was doing this not for money, not for thanks, but because he saw a simple, decent thing that needed fixing and a principled person who needed a moment's rest from fighting. The stakes had been set. The town's survival hinged on the water. Evelyn's freedom was tethered to the little schoolhouse, and Boone Calder, the quiet man who hated injustice, had unintentionally hammered himself a place right in the middle of Crowley's ambition, becoming the necessary thorn in the judge's side. The battle for the red dust and the clean water was just beginning, and it would be fought over a tin roof, a school ledger, and a cowboy's slow, steady commitment to simple decency. The new wanted poster was pinned up on the telegraph office wall early that morning, crisp and white against the peeling, sun-bleached wood. It was an immediate escalation. This one was far more descriptive than the hastily drawn notice Evelyn had seen the day before. It spoke of a lone male accomplice to the mail theft, unidentified. Yet the detailed description was unmistakably crafted to target Boone Calder, a tall, powerful cowboy wears a distinct dark hat and gray coat, known to be a crack shot who prefers warning shots to engagement, recently seen riding a bay horse in the vicinity of Red Mesa. The Crows were busy, led by Murdoch. They were quick to stand near the poster, pointing and whispering loudly to the few townsfolk who dared linger on the street. The narrative was simple and effective. Boone wasn't a hero, but a decoy, a distraction for the real bandits. And his quick defense of Noah was merely a slick trick to gain sympathy. "That's him, I tell you," Murdoch was saying to a small cluster of men, including Daniel Foster, Noah's father, a quiet, hard-working man who fixed wagons. "Fits the description to a T. Only reason he didn't shoot us was 'cause he was trying to look innocent for the schoolmarm." Daniel Foster shifted uncomfortably. He owed the general store, which was essentially owned by Crowley's credit, a considerable sum, and he had a deep fear of the judge. He knew the truth about Boone's actions, having seen the quick, decisive rope work that saved his son, but he was also terrified of being blacklisted. Murdoch turned his attention directly to Foster, lowering his voice into a menacing drawl. "You were there, Foster. You saw that drifter. You tell the sheriff he was acting suspicious, lurking about. You don't, and well, Judge Crowley knows you've been letting your boy skip a few days of school to help you haul wood. He's going to say you're unfit, that your testimony is tainted. And Miss Hart, you say the wrong thing, and she flies out of a job faster than a startled quail." Foster visibly paled, his gaze dropping to the dirt. "But he saved Noah." "Saved him from a horse you didn't tether properly." "Maybe." Murdoch sneered. He took a heavy step toward Foster, crowding him against the porch post. "You just stick to the story. Daniel, the cowboy was suspicious. That's all. Keep your mouth shut about the good part, and keep your job." Evelyn had been retrieving a forgotten shawl from May Alvarez's stable when she heard the raised voices. She saw the intimidation immediately. Murdoch's bulky form trapping the smaller, anxious man. The threat against her, though secondary to Foster's immediate terror, ignited a cold, hard anger in her chest. She walked out from the shadowed mouth of the stable and onto the dusty street, her posture straight and her expression unwavering. "Mr. Foster's testimony is already on record. Mr. Murdoch," Evelyn said, her voice clear and carrying. Cutting through the silence Murdoch's intimidation had created, he told Sheriff Gaines that Mr. Calder risked his life to save his son. Murdoch swung around, his face dark with annoyance at the interruption. "Stay out of this, schoolmarm. This is men's business." "When it concerns the safety of a child in my classroom, it is my business," Evelyn countered, stepping directly into the small space between the two men. It was an incredibly reckless move. She was small and completely unarmed, relying only on the power of her conviction. "You are twisting the truth to pressure a man who is only worried about feeding his family. That is not justice, it is extortion." Murdoch chuckled, a rough, humorless sound, and reached out, not quite to strike her, but to shove her forcefully out of the way. "You got a mighty big mouth for a woman who relies on the judge's good graces to keep that rundown school open." The push was sharp and unexpected. Evelyn lost her footing on the uneven ground and stumbled backward, landing heavily on the dusty planks of the general store porch. The air rushed out of her lungs in a painful gasp, and for a moment, the world was just red dust and the sharp ache in her elbow. Murdoch didn't stop, looming over her, enjoying the sudden, satisfying submission of the rigid schoolteacher. "Now listen here, little miss!" A new sound entered the scene, the rhythmic, measured clopping of horse hooves. Not a gallop, not a rushed entry, but the slow, deliberate pace of a man who was utterly unhurried. Boone Calder rode in from the far end of the street. Having completed his errand at the blacksmith's, he saw the cluster of men, the fallen woman, and Murdoch standing over her, his hands balled into fists. Boone didn't reach for his gun. He kept his hands in clear sight, letting the silence and his presence do the work. He rode Scout up to the porch, stopped directly beside the pole supporting the awning, and, with a slow, powerful movement, wrapped his horse's leather reins around the thick wooden post. He made sure the leather was tight, secure. The act was profoundly simple, yet it carried the weight of a declaration he wasn't passing through, and he wasn't going anywhere until this was settled. Murdoch hesitated, caught between the instinct to fight and the memory of Boone's devastating accuracy with a rifle. Boone dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thump. He didn't look at Murdoch first. He looked at Evelyn, still sitting up, pushing herself off the floor, her dress stained with dirt, her face pale but her eyes blazing. Then he looked at Daniel Foster, who stood paralyzed, caught in the moral crossfire. Finally, Boone turned to Murdoch. His voice was quiet, dangerously so, carrying no theatrical threat, only cold certainty. "You lay hands on her again," Boone stated, his eyes fixed on Murdoch's. "And that pole is the only thing that's going to keep you upright." Murdoch sputtered, reaching instinctively for the pistol holstered on his hip. "You threatening an officer of the law, drifter. I got a warrant for men matching your description." "I am a man who was asked to fix a roof," Boone replied, standing still, his hands loose at his sides. "And I don't see any roof fixing going on with the schoolmarm on the ground. Unwind your rope." "Murdoch, this is done." The crowd that had gathered was silent, mesmerized by the quiet tension. Boone had the advantage of absolute calm. He was presenting a choice violence, or retreat. Since Boone hadn't drawn a weapon, a gunfight initiated by Murdoch would look unprovoked, even to the sheriff. With a curse, Murdoch spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust, shot a venomous look at Evelyn, and turned away, storming toward his horse. The other crows quickly followed. As the commotion subsided, Evelyn slowly rose, dusting off her skirt. She noticed two things about Boone. First, he was still standing exactly where he had stopped, his posture loose but ready. Second, his hands had never once strayed toward his weapon. The moment Murdoch was gone, Evelyn felt a wave of relief, followed by a deeper sense of respect. She saw the fierce control, the deliberate de-escalation that was so rare in the territory. It wasn't cowardice, it was a choice. Boone Calder refused to kill, even in a confrontation that easily called for a drawn gun. This restraint, this moral line drawn in the dust, was the foundation of the trust that would grow between them. Silas Crowley was not a man to rely on subordinates. He arranged to meet Boone Calder himself at the Yellow Cactus Saloon an hour later. Crowley chose the place because its noise and activity offered both an audience and an illusion of casual conversation. Boone, nursing a single cup of black coffee at the counter he rarely drank, watched Crowley approach. Sensing the judge's predatory assurance, "Calder," Crowley said, not as a greeting, but as a confirmation of ownership. He sat down heavily on a stool. "You're a man who knows horses, and you clearly know how to handle a rifle. You're wasted protecting a schoolteacher's bruised ego." "I was helping fix her roof," Boone corrected him, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "There's a difference." "A semantic difference," Crowley dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Let's be practical. That bounty poster, the one about the dark hat, it's a nuisance. You and I both know you're not a thief. But Sheriff Gaines is a busy man, and I am the law in this county. I can make that nuisance disappear, or I can make it grow into a very serious inconvenience." Boone waited, his face unreadable. "I need men who can handle the cleanup phase of my operation," Crowley continued, leaning in conspiratorially. "Closing off the northern range, moving out the squatters and the small-time cowhands who think they can use my land for free. It requires certain firm actions. Come work for the ranch. A good wage, full immunity from any past, present, or future misunderstandings with the law. All charges, posters, and rumors vanish." Boone set his coffee cup down gently. The small, solid clink echoed in the sudden gap in the saloon's ambient noise. He knew what Crowley meant by cleanup. It meant violence, intimidation, and likely murder. All sanctioned by the man who held the law in his pocket. "You want me to string barbed wire for you, Judge," Boone stated flatly, "and run off men like Daniel Foster so you can take their water." Crowley smiled, a thin, self-satisfied gesture. "I want you to bring order and prosperity to a territory that desperately needs it. What's one schoolhouse against the good of the entire county's cattle industry? A schoolhouse teaches a person to read. You want a man who can follow orders and doesn't ask questions," Boone said, shaking his head slightly. "That's not me anymore." "Judge, I'm afraid I'll have to pass on your job offer." Crowley's face hardened. The polite veneer cracked, revealing the cold core of his power. "You refuse? You choose to stand with the pathetic little schoolmarm and her collection of dirty immigrants and half-breed children." "I chose the side of the people who didn't try to buy me," Boone replied, pushing himself away from the counter. "Then you've chosen a fight you can't win. Calder!" Crowley spat. "If you stand with her, you're the enemy of this town's future. I'll make sure you regret the day you ever roped that child's horse." The very next day, Crowley delivered on his threat, targeting Evelyn directly. Sheriff Gaines, looking miserable, rode up to the schoolhouse with an official county seal in his hand. He wasn't one of Crowley's crows, but he was bound by his legal authority. "Miss Hart, I'm sorry about this," Gaines muttered, handing Evelyn a heavy document. "Judge Crowley has signed an order closing the school, effective immediately. Cites structural instability and insufficient safety protocols under the new municipal code. It's temporary," he says, "until the land is deemed safe, which, we all know, means until it's condemned and sold." This was the core story conflict. The real plot kick, Crowley wasn't just targeting the water anymore. He was attacking the community's heart. Evelyn felt a familiar wave of panic and despair, but it was quickly replaced by resolute defiance. "Insufficient safety," Evelyn retorted, looking at the roof Boone had fixed just yesterday. "He means inconvenient location for his barbed wire." "The order is legal, Miss Hart," the sheriff insisted, shuffling his feet. Evelyn looked around her small classroom, the worn benches, the precious few books, the slate board covered with Noah's imperfect but enthusiastic attempts at arithmetic. This was her mission. Her self-made corner of the world. She would not let it be taken. She made a decision then that was not just about the school, but about challenging the deep-seated prejudices Crowley manipulated. Evelyn walked straight to the church and posted a small, handwritten notice next to Crowley's legal order. It was an invitation. Simple and direct, she would not abandon her class, but relocate it. The Red Mesa School will hold free evening classes for all children and adults whose daily work prevents them from attending. This includes the children of minors, Mexican migrants, and the Navajo community. Instruction will cover reading, arithmetic, and basic legal rights regarding land tenure. It was a deliberate, open challenge. She was explicitly reaching out to the marginalized groups Crowley was trying to suppress, using education as a rallying point against prejudice. The next morning, Evelyn received unexpected support. Boone Calder appeared at the schoolhouse, not with a hammer this time, but with a battered shovel. "Heard you're teaching people to read their rights now," Boone said, tipping his hat. "Needs a reliable light, doesn't it?" "It does," Evelyn replied, her heart lifting. "And protection from the crows." "I'm volunteering for night watch," Boone stated. "I'll keep my bedroll here, and this shovel is for digging a simple catch basin and rain channel to divert water from the spring during the flash floods. If we can prove the land is structurally sound and has good water management, it undercuts Crowley's safety argument." Boone Calder, the reluctant hero, had officially chosen his side. The rising social conflict began that Sunday. Reverend Hale, still pressured by the wealthy, conservative members of his flock, preached a nervous sermon. "We must maintain the decorum of our community," Hale pleaded, looking pointedly in Evelyn's direction. "The schoolhouse is for proper Christian children, not a haven for for vagrants and those with questionable morality. The schoolmarm is inviting a godless element, including a known associate of outlaws near our children. Some of the churchgoers murmured their agreement, their fear of losing credit lines outweighing their desire for simple justice. They're afraid of anyone who doesn't look exactly like them. Boone observed to Evelyn later that day, as he supervised Noah and 2 other boys clearing debris near the new drainage ditch. They're afraid of losing their land, and Crowley uses prejudice as his shield. Evelyn sighed. Despite the fear, Evelyn held her first evening class. The response was immediate and heartening. Fathers who had worked the mines all day, mothers speaking Spanish, and a few quiet Navajo elders sat alongside the regular day students, all desperate for the knowledge Evelyn offered. It was during this time that Evelyn's shy exterior began to soften, allowing a genuine wry humor to peek through. She had acquired a stubborn, old horse named Beans from May, hoping to gain some independence and stop relying on the kindness of strangers. Beans was a horse that seemed to exist purely out of spite. One afternoon, Boone found Evelyn in May's corral, struggling to get Beans to move faster than a melancholy shuffle. "He won't canter, Mr. Calder. He just keeps sighing," Evelyn complained, breathless. Boone leaned against the fence, arms crossed, trying to hide a smile. "He's reading your mind, Miss Hart. You're trying too hard. You're giving him too many instructions." "But how do I make him go faster?" "You need to breathe, steady and calm, like you're reading dictation to your class," Boone instructed. "Beans respects precision and a steady rhythm." Evelyn took a deep breath, mimicking the tone she used for the 3rd grade spelling lesson. She tried a smooth signal. Beans took 2 steps and then stopped dead, cocking one ear back at her. Evelyn threw her hands up in exasperation. "If that horse had to take a spelling test, he'd fail." Boone threw back his head and laughed, a full, rich sound that surprised Evelyn and warmed the dry air between them. "Good," he managed, wiping a bit of dust from his eye. "At least he knows how to run in the wrong direction. That's a start. Now, try breathing like you're about to yell at Murdoch." Evelyn smiled, a genuine, relaxed curve of the lips, and tried again. In that shared, dusty moment, the burden of the school, the land, and the law felt momentarily lighter, replaced by the simple, enduring humor of the frontier. She knew then, with a growing sense of certainty, that Boone Calder was not going to leave, and she knew that his quiet, formidable presence had given her the strength to hold the line against the red dust and the growing darkness. The air was heavy and still, the kind of oppressive silence that precedes sudden violence, whether human or natural. Boone had finished digging the deep catch basin near the schoolhouse, routing a simple ditch away from the foundation. The work was meant to preemptively challenge Crowley's claims of instability, but it also kept him close. He slept on a cot in the small, open-sided lean-to that served as the school's hay and storage shed, a silent, watchful guardian of Evelyn's uncompromising vision. The crows knew he was there. They had stopped throwing rocks at the tin roof, but their vigilance only tightened the sense of siege. The attack came just after midnight. Boone awoke, not to noise, but to the smell of smoke, not the slow, pleasant scent of his own banked campfire, but the sharp, angry odor of burning hay and wood accelerating in the dry air. He was on his feet instantly. The small hay shed, tucked behind the school, was fully engulfed. The flames licked violently at the dry, stacked bundles of prairie hay, roaring towards the schoolhouse itself, carried by a sudden fierce wind that sprang up from nowhere. It was a clear, malicious attempt to destroy the building and everything inside it. Evelyn Boone yelled, sprinting towards the roaring fire. Evelyn, who was a light sleeper, was already halfway out the schoolhouse door. She saw the blaze and the immediate danger to the small building. There was no well nearby, only the catchment tank Boone had just dug and a couple of half-full barrels they used for washing slate boards. Boone didn't waste time on the shed. It was gone. His focus was on the school. He grabbed the largest barrel of water near the back door meant for the ditch work and, with a primal yell, flung himself into the inferno's periphery, aiming the barrel at the nearest wall of the schoolhouse. The water hit the dry wood with a hiss, momentarily cooling the surface and buying them precious seconds. Evelyn, meanwhile, didn't panic. Her discipline kicked in. She had about 15 students who sometimes stayed the night, children of the distant miners or the railroad workers who couldn't commute twice a day. They were awake, terrified, huddled in the center of the room. "Children, line up, Noah! You take the front!" Evelyn commanded, her voice high and tight, but absolutely firm. "Smallest buckets first. We are saving the building and what's inside. Move, quickly and calmly." She directed them to the small water barrels. They formed a frantic, clumsy, but effective chain, passing small buckets of dirty water, one by one, from the door to Boone, who was working the point of highest heat, fighting to keep the flames from jumping the final distance. The desperate effort was a mix of chaos and precision. While the children worked the water line, Evelyn plunged back into the smoky schoolhouse, knowing exactly what to save. It wasn't the books, which were replaceable. It was the records. Gasping, she grabbed a metal box containing the school's original deed and the land survey map, the one clearly marking the public right-of-way to the spring. Proof that Crowley was legally trespassing. She also snatched her personal ledger, containing the names, families, and locations of every child she taught, including the marginalized children Crowley sought to exclude. She shoved the documents under a bench and ran back outside. Joining the bucket line, Boone fought the blaze like a madman, his face blackened with soot, his shirt scorched. The children, fueled by Evelyn's fearlessness, worked harder than they knew how. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to push the fire back to the shed's ruins, containing the damage and saving the school. As the smoke cleared, leaving only a glowing, evil red pile of ash, Boone slumped against the wall, chest heaving. Evelyn and the children stood, breathless, covered in soot and wet mud. It was Noah, the little boy Boone had saved before, who pointed a small, muddy finger into the dirt near the corner of the fence line. "Look, Miss Hart, fresh tracks." They examined the tracks by the first light of dawn. The trail was clear, leading away from the burned shed and towards the public spring access path. The ground was soft there, damp from Boone's newly dug drainage channel. The tracks were heavy boot prints, distinctive for the small, half-moon heel plate Evelyn recognized from seeing Murdoch around town. More damning, right next to the boot prints were parallel lines drawn across the earth. Boone knelt, running a finger along the marks. "Barbed wire," he stated, his voice low and hard. "They finished stringing it up last night, used the fire as a distraction, or maybe they just wanted to get rid of the school before it became a problem." The implication was clear. Crowley's men had not only set the fire, they had used the ensuing chaos to tighten their illegal fence line around the public water path. The new strands of barbed wire, sharp, metallic, and utterly final, represented Crowley's complete disregard for the community. The fire was an act of aggression. The wire was the declaration of war. The fight was no longer just legal, it was existential. The barbed wire, a symbol of modern corporate control, was cutting off the town's lifeblood. The morning after the fire brought a relentless, unseasonable windstorm. The wind was so strong it seemed to carry stones. It hammered the patched tin roof of the school, tearing loose a section Boone had worked on, and filled the new drainage ditch with a suffocating layer of red sand. When Evelyn tried to use the bucket pump, the well proved almost entirely dry, choked with fine, wind-blown silt. The harsh environment was reinforcing Crowley's claims, pressing the townsfolk into a panic of survival. They took shelter inside the smoke-scented schoolroom. Evelyn was cleaning her valuable land documents, the maps and the deed, while Boone was trying to secure the remaining roof section with a rope run over the entire building. In that cramped, gritty space, the walls between them fell away. Evelyn, exhausted, looked at the map, tracing the spring line. "It's so clean, Mr. Calder. The law is so clear, but he just does it anyway. The power of his money and his sheer audacity." Boone paused in his work, sitting down heavily on the floor, the rope still in his hands. He watched the grit swirl outside the window. "It's the wire, Miss Hart. That's the real audacity," he said, his voice flat. "It's the cheapest, cruelest way to settle a country. I spent 2 years riding for a ranch in Texas that used wire to shut off traditional grazing routes. They used it to starve the small ranch hands out. I was one of the men who helped put it up." Evelyn looked at him, surprised by the confession. Boone rarely spoke of his past. "It was dirty work. I didn't think about the consequences, then just the paycheck. But the next spring, I saw what happened. Families lost their herds, their land. The wire changed the rules. It turned neighbors into enemies and property into a prison. I quit that day, threw down my tools and rode out. Been riding ever since, never staying long enough to feel responsible for another man's greed." The shared silence that followed was charged with the weight of his admission. Boone had not run from cowardice, but from guilt. He was the perpetual wanderer because he refused to partake in sanctioned cruelty. Again. "I understand the running," Evelyn whispered, looking down at her hands. "I came here to run too, not from lawlessness, but from the demands of being a proper lady in Missouri. They had my life planned out, a respectable marriage, quiet submission, and no opinions. I ran here to have my own life, my own classroom, my own quiet freedom." She laughed, a short, self-deprecating sound. "But Red Mesa is worse. Here, you have to fight for the right to breathe. I was afraid, Mr. Calder, afraid of the gossip, the loss of my reputation as a virtuous teacher. I thought I could fight the judge with paperwork and good manners." Boone looked at the soot on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the fire in her spirit. "Virtue needs water to drink, Miss Hart," Boone quipped softly, using the everyday humor they were both coming to rely on. "If you're too dry and exhausted, you can't fight. Crowley wants you to worry about reputation, so you stop worrying about the barbed wire." They shared a tired smile, a moment of profound, simple connection forged by mutual danger and shared understanding. Evelyn realized her fear of judgment was just as suffocating as Crowley's fence. The small local gazette, the Red Mesa Register, came out twice a week, and its latest edition delivered an unexpected counterpunch. The editor and proprietor, May Alvarez, the pragmatic, sharp-witted owner of the Yellow Cactus, had chosen a clear side. Her new editorial, placed prominently on the front page, avoided mentioning Crowley by name but was unmistakably directed at the land dispute. It praised the courageous actions of the schoolmarm and her pupils in saving the town's future education center from a suspicious fire. It went on to question the sudden implementation of obscure municipal codes and the rapid construction of barbed wire fences near public resources, subtly asking, is the law intended to serve the community, or only one man's pocketbook? It was a small, crucial shift. May had wielded the power of the press, creating a crack in the solid wall of Crowley's control. That same day, Boone was fetching coffee for Evelyn at the Yellow Cactus when he overheard a low, hurried conversation between Murdoch and 2 other crows. They didn't see him, as he was tucked behind the large stove waiting for the coffee to brew. "He got the documents ready," Murdoch was saying. "Says the fire gave him the perfect excuse. He's going to petition the county assessor on Monday, claim the land is hazardous, and force a judicial auction on the school plot next Thursday. Says he'll buy it for tax arrears." Boone's hand tightened around the coffee pot handle. An auction, a legal maneuver to seize the land under the guise of an emergency sale, was the final, swift move. Evelyn's carefully collected maps and deeds would mean nothing if the land was legally seized and sold before she could present her evidence in a proper court. He hurried back to the schoolhouse with the urgent news. Evelyn listened, her face turning pale as she grasped the speed and ruthlessness of the plan. "We need 60 days to raise the full funds for a legal challenge. An auction next week is impossible." She looked down at the documents she'd risked the fire for, Then out at the children practicing their alphabet on the slate boards. The school was still technically closed, but the children came anyway, sitting outside, doing their lessons under the harsh sun. "We fight his public pressure with more public pressure," Evelyn declared, an inspired light coming into her eyes. "He wants to sell our symbol of community for cheap. We will show him its value. We will raise the profile and the funds in one day, and force him to publicly confront the community he is robbing." Boone raised a questioning eyebrow. "How, Miss Hart? You have less than a week." "A school fair," Evelyn said firmly, slamming her hand on the wooden desk. "We will invite the whole town. The miners, the Navajo, the railroad men, everyone. We will make it a grand, impossible celebration. We will use the auction to raise money to fix the roof, buy books, and hire a lawyer. More importantly, we'll force Crowley to show up, and he won't be able to enforce his court order with the whole town watching." The plan was audacious and wildly impractical, exactly what the situation demanded. Boone, listening to her fiery determination, couldn't help but smile. A fair, shooting contests, pie baking, and public defiance sounds like Red Mesa's idea of fun. Preparations began immediately. Evelyn found a moment to work with Noah on his writing, trying to perfect his letters. Noah, energized by the prospect of a school fair, was trying to write Boone's name. "Look, Miss Hart," Noah said proudly, showing her his slate. The letter B was a large, awkward loop with a trailing horizontal line, looking more like a side view of a small cow. Evelyn stifled a laugh. "Oh, Noah, that is very enthusiastic." Boone, walking by, looked over her shoulder. "That letter B," he observed, hands on his hips. "Looks like a calf that knows it's about to be branded." Evelyn smiled warmly at the boy. "It's good. Noah, at least it knows how to run." Boone nodded, accepting the simple humor. "That's true. In this town, sometimes the best thing a person can do is run to the right place and stand still." He didn't need to say he had run to Red Mesa and was now standing still. Evelyn knew. She saw the quiet strength in him, the man who had abandoned the life of a hired gun for a simple, principled stand. She saw the future of Red Mesa, not in the money, but in the combined spirit of a schoolmarm's bravery and a cowboy's weary but determined heart. They would have their school fair, and they would challenge the law with the combined will of the community. The day of the Red Mesa School Fair dawned, impossibly, with a slightly gentler sun. Evelyn and Boone had worked tirelessly for 4 days, transforming the dusty, condemned school lot into a bustling community center. Boone's work crews, composed of fathers from the miners' camp and the rail yard, had managed to erect temporary awnings using old canvas and wooden posts, creating vital shade. The fair was a beautiful, messy portrait of frontier life, a defiance painted in primary colors against the red dust. Children ran chaotic slingshot target practice, aiming at empty tin cans Boone had set up on a low fence line. May Alvarez, proprietor of the Yellow Cactus, had set up a massive cast-iron cauldron, filling the air with the rich, savory smell of seasoned baked beans. The women of the town, including many who had previously shunned Evelyn due to the rumors, were running a spirited pie auction, their face flushed with the heat of competitive baking and camaraderie. The air was thick with the unexpected unity of people who realized their backs were against the same wall. The miners, the Mexican families, and even a handful of quiet Navajo traders who rarely ventured into town mingled with the established townsfolk. They were there for the fun, but mostly, they were there to stand with the school that had stood with them. Evelyn, wearing a simple linen dress and a smear of soot she couldn't quite rub off, moved through the crowd, her shyness forgotten in the urgency of her mission. She was collecting change, offering thanks, and smiling until her cheeks hurt. "We've raised nearly $40 already." "Boone," she whispered excitedly, finding him near the slingshot range, where he was showing Noah how to steady his aim. "That's enough for a full re-roof and maybe a few books." "Keep counting, Miss Hart," Boone replied, adjusting his dark hat. "You'll need more than a few books. You need a lawyer." Their moment of celebration was abruptly cut short. A sudden hush fell over the crowd, starting at the edge of the lot and spreading inward like a cold tide. Silas Crowley arrived. He did not come alone. Behind him rode Sheriff Gaines and two serious-looking deputies from the county seat, men Evelyn hadn't seen before, wearing official, severe uniforms. Crowley, immaculate in a dark suit despite the heat, rode scout past the pie auction and stopped his horse dead in the center of the fairground, directly in front of the makeshift stage Evelyn had set up for speeches. The fun stopped. The slingshots fell silent. The air grew heavy, thick not with bean smoke, but with intimidation. Crowley sat tall on his saddle, his face set in a cold mask of legal authority. He held a document aloft. "People of Red Mesa," Crowley announced, his voice booming and laced with artificial dignity. "I regret to inform you that this unauthorized gathering must cease immediately. This land has been deemed hazardous due to recent criminal arson, and further, due to the unsanctioned presence of vagrants. This school lot is now under county jurisdiction. I have here a court order, signed by myself as Justice of the Peace, declaring a full, immediate lockdown until the judicial auction is finalized." The crowd murmured anxiously. Fear was a palpable force. People began to look nervously toward the exit. Crowley had effectively weaponized the law. Sheriff Gaines looked profoundly unhappy, but slowly began to dismount. "I am authorized," Crowley continued, glaring directly at Evelyn, who stood firm by the stage, "to enforce this closure and to remove any materials that constitute a danger or nuisance to the property, effective immediately." He intended to seize the school's materials and, likely, Evelyn's box of legal documents. Boone, who had been standing slightly apart, calmly walked toward the front of the stage. He moved slowly, deliberately, stopping 2 feet from Crowley's horse. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a tightly rolled piece of parchment, slightly singed around the edges. "Before you enforce anything, Judge," Boone said, his voice quiet but carrying the cold authority of undeniable fact, "you might want to check what your fire department saved." Boone unrolled the document with a snap. It was the land survey map Evelyn had rescued from the hayshed fire, the one that proved the public nature of the spring access. "This map," Boone announced, holding it up so the crowd could see the aged official script, "is the original 1871 county survey. It shows the school lot and the entirety of the main spring as public domain with a designated common usage easement leading right past the school and down the slope. Your new barbed wire fence, Judge, which you claim to be on your property line, is currently enclosing over 20 feet of public easement, as established by this document." The crowd erupted in a clamor of outrage. They understood land and water. Crowley hadn't just tried to buy the land, he had been actively, illegally stealing the town's water supply and the right-of-way needed to access it. Crowley's face went from smug authority to absolute fury. "That document is a forgery, a worthless piece of paper salvaged by a known outlaw." As if on cue, Murdoch, who had ridden in with Crowley, shouted from the back of the crowd, "He's a thief. People, he's here to stir up trouble. Get out of here before he shoots up the place again." Murdoch, emboldened by the presence of the deputies, began marching toward Boone, his hand resting menacingly on his holstered pistol. This was the micro-climax, the flashpoint. Evelyn held her breath, knowing Boone's reputation for deadly accuracy and his deep reluctance to use it against another man. If Boone drew his pistol now, the authorities would have every right to shoot him down, and Crowley would win the moral argument. Boone didn't reach for the pistol. He reached for the Winchester rifle he had leaned against the stage leg. He brought the rifle up in a smooth, lightning-fast motion, aiming not at Murdoch, but just above his head. Crack! The sound was deafening in the sudden silence. Murdoch flinched violently. Covering his head, the air around his head seemed to shimmer. He looked up, confused, then reached instinctively for his hat. It wasn't there. Murdoch's dark, sweat-stained hat landed in the dust 10 feet behind him. A small, clean hole right through the center of the crown. The shot was so impossibly precise it left no doubt Boone could have killed the man instantly. But he chose to merely remove his hat. The crowd gasped. Then, a beat later, the children led by Noah, whose eyes were wide with pure admiration, burst into applause, a joyous, relieved sound of collective victory. Murdoch stood there, humiliated, his thick neck red with shame and fury, completely disarmed by an act of spectacular, controlled violence. He looked like a fool, and the entire community saw it. Reverend Hale, who had been standing near the church tent, his face etched with conflict, finally saw the truth laid bare. One man came with the law and threatened destruction. The other came with a gun and showed perfect restraint. The true violence was in Crowley's words, not Boone's action. Seizing the momentum, Evelyn stepped onto the low stage, placing herself directly in front of Boone and the rifle. Her voice was strong, steady, and amplified by the collective emotion of the crowd. "Judge Crowley says this land is hazardous," Evelyn declared, sweeping her gaze across the gathered faces. "But the real hazard isn't the fire they set, it's the greed they represent. This school is more than just a piece of property. It is the place that teaches Noah, and your children, and the children of the people they call vagrant, to read the laws that Judge Crowley seeks to pervert. It is the place that keeps our children from the wilderness, not the wilderness of the desert, but the wilderness in the heart." Her words, simple and profound, hit home. The townsfolk weren't just fighting for a plot of land. They were fighting for the moral center of their community. Before Crowley could recover, May Alvarez pushed through the crowd, holding a thick, worn book with a torn cover, the County Register of Ordinances. May was not just the saloon owner. She was the town's only real authority on paperwork outside of Crowley. "Judge," May's voice rang out with the crisp authority of ink and paper. "You came here to conduct a judicial auction, but you failed to observe County Ordinance 4B. Crowley looked stunned. "What are you talking about, woman?" "Ordinance 4B, May stated, tapping the book emphatically. "In the event of a public dispute over community land and a failure of the local justice to act neutrally, if the community can present a petition signed by 2/3 of the property owners and registered inhabitants, the forced sale is temporarily stayed for 60 days to allow for a full county review." It was a brilliant legal counterpunch, a tiny, ancient regulation Crowley had overlooked. Evelyn, recognizing the opportunity, rushed off the stage, pulling her ledger from the schoolhouse. "We have a petition right here," she announced. "Everyone who believes this school is vital to the future of Red Mesa. Everyone who wants free, public access to the water and the land. Sign here." The signing began immediately. It was a visible, defiant act of unity that transcended the prejudice Crowley had tried to foster. Daniel Foster, the wagon fixer, was the first to sign, his hand shaking but firm. Then came the Mexican migrant workers, who could barely write their names but proudly marked their X's. The Navajo elders signed, the miners, the women from the pie auction, even the miserable Reverend Hale, his face pale with guilt and determination, stepped up and added his name, showing the public where his moral allegiance finally lay. It was a collective, powerful act of democracy. The pen became their weapon. Crowley, his face contorted with impotent rage, saw his legal trap demolished by a forgotten ordinance and a determined schoolteacher. He barked orders at the sheriff, but Gaines, looking at the 200 signatures already collected, simply shook his head. "The petition is legal. Judge." Sheriff Gaines confirmed, folding his arms. "The forced sale is stayed for 60 days. You'll have to argue this at the county court in Silverton." Crowley, defeated and publicly exposed, wheeled his horse around violently. He didn't speak to the crowd. He spoke only to Boone and Evelyn, his voice low, venomous and promising total destruction. "This is not over. Calder, I will make sure you disappear, and I will make sure this schoolmarm loses everything. including her good name. He spurred his horse and galloped away, followed by Murdoch and the deputies. The crowd erupted into cheers, a roar of pure, unified relief. The school was safe, for now. As the sun began to dip, casting long, peaceful shadows over the fairground, the cleanup was quick and easy. The atmosphere was light, buoyant with the taste of victory. Evelyn stood by the empty stage, watching the last families leave. She was physically drained but buoyed by a deep, quiet joy. Boone, who had been silently supervising the return of borrowed equipment, came over. He wasn't talking about the shooting or the law. He was focused on the school itself. He walked to the corner and began gently tapping on the rope run support Boone had fashioned. The fire was rough on the bell rope. Boone observed quietly. The tin's stable, but the mechanism needs oil and a better pull chain. Evelyn watched him work, his large, competent hands moving with meticulous care on the small, delicate machinery of the bell. It was the same quality she had seen in his quick, clean actions, a focus on the task, a respect for the instrument, whether it was a rifle or a bell. Boone, Evelyn said, using his first name for the first time, testing the sound of it, finding it comforting. Thank you for the map and for the hat. Boone paused and looked up, meeting her eyes. Hat trick was for the kids. They need to know restraint beats brute force, even out here. I know, but it was also chivalrous. Boone gave a short, self-deprecating laugh. Just practical. Miss Hart, if I'd killed him, I wouldn't be here to fix the bell. And you need the bell for the morning dictation. I'm having beans and cornbread for dinner, Evelyn said, suddenly changing the subject, her heart beating a little faster. I made a huge batch for the fair and have too much left over. Would you join me? We can eat, and you can tell me about the proper way to oil a bell. Boone hesitated for only a second, the light flickering in his eyes a blend of surprise and acceptance. He rarely stayed for dinner, preferring the solitary camp life. But this was different. This wasn't pity or obligation. It was an invitation born of trust and shared struggle. I haven't had a home-cooked meal in about 3 years, he admitted, his voice soft. But only if you let me bring the pie. May sold me the last slice of apple at auction, and it's too big for one man to tackle alone. They ate on the porch steps, sharing the simple meal and the last slice of pie, their laughter mixing easily, a sound of profound relief after the exhausting high drama of the day. For the first time, Evelyn realized she wasn't just fighting for a school. She was fighting for the right to share simple, quiet moments like this. Boone, watching her tired, happy smile, knew he wasn't just guarding a school, he was guarding the best part of the town's uncertain future. The reprieve granted by the school fair was short-lived. Red Mesa was a town accustomed to hardship, but even the old-timers muttered about the ferocity of the sandstorm that hit 3 days later. It wasn't just wind. It was an enveloping, suffocating, elemental fury. The sky turned a sickly orange-brown. Visibility dropped to a few feet, and the grinding, abrasive sand worked its way into every crack, seam, and breath. The violence of nature drove everyone to ground, but it also physically forced Evelyn and Boone into closer proximity. They took refuge in the small, newly stable schoolhouse. When the wind finally began to die down 24 hours later, they stepped out to find the landscape profoundly changed. The small stable belonging to May Alvarez, where Evelyn kept her stubborn horse Beans, was half buried in a massive drift of red sand. Fence posts were snapped, and the drainage channel Boone had painstakingly dug around the school was completely choked and invisible. The natural world had asserted its power, reinforcing the existential struggle for survival and pushing the human element into sharper focus. But a more corrosive force than the sandstorm had also taken hold. During the confinement, Crowley's men, the Crows, had been busy. When Evelyn walked down the main street, she saw it plastered to the yellow cactus wall, written in clumsy, large letters designed to catch the eye, a crudely produced wall sheet. It was filled with venomous gossip, calling Evelyn an unfit woman of loose morals who was privately consorting with a known outlaw and accusing her of using the town's children as a shield for her private affairs. The words hit Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. Worse than the push from Murdoch. The fight for the land was one thing. The assault on her character, the very thing she had tried to protect by moving west, was devastating. The shame and the fear of judgment, the old ghosts from Missouri, rose up. She felt a sickening wave of guilt, believing she had compromised the children's safety and future by drawing Boone's protection and Crowley's ire. She sat at her desk, pen in hand, staring at the resignation letter she had begun drafting. I must step down to restore the school's good standing and protect the children's reputation. Boone found her there, the air heavy with smoke and the fine scent of dust. He saw the letter and knew, instinctively, the depth of her pain. He didn't try to argue with her logic, but with the moral premise that was driving her. He left her there and rode to the wooden church, finding Reverend Hale alone in the empty sanctuary, sweeping sand from the altar. "Reverend," Boone said, removing his hat as he stepped into the quiet gloom. "I need to talk to you about reputation." The Reverend, still wrestling with his public support of the school, looked weary. "Mr. Calder, I know the gossip. It is a terrible thing, but Miss Hart knows the Lord will forgive her." "Forgive her for what?" Boone cut in, his voice calm but firm. "For accepting help when her life was in danger, or for teaching children who Crowley says don't belong here. For the appearance of impropriety, for protecting you," the Reverend insisted. "In this town, a woman's honor is everything." Boone placed his hat on the nearest pew, his blue eyes fixed on the troubled man of God. "Reverend, the most honorable thing a person can do is protect the weak and tell the truth. Your honor, or Miss Hart's, is worthless if it requires you to stand silent while a powerful man burns a school and steals a town's water. Real honor is not a reputation you keep clean. It's the weak thing you protect. And if she stays, they will destroy her good name entirely. Silas Crowley has the power to slander her," Boone countered. "But only she has the power to destroy her honor. If she walks away now, because of his lies, then he wins. He proves that a strong woman, a good school, and the truth can all be defeated by a cheap lie. Is that the lesson you want the children of Red Mesa to learn from the church?" The Reverend flinched, recognizing the biblical weight of Boone's argument. He looked at the window, now mostly obscured by sand, and saw the reflection of the lonely cowboy, standing for a truth the church should have defended long ago. The Reverend was deeply unsettled, the moral clarity Boone provided cutting through the dense fear of his creditors. Meanwhile, Crowley escalated the fight with a weapon far more dangerous than gossip technology. He had successfully bribed the lone telegraph operator, a nervous young man named Walter. Crowley was dictating a falsified, urgent telegram addressed to the county assessor in Silverton, claiming that the recent school fair had devolved into a dangerous public riot orchestrated by the foreign element and the armed bandit, Boone Calder. His goal was to nullify the petition, override the 60-day stay, and force the land sale through immediately. Just as Walter began tapping out the message, the front door of the telegraph office burst open, and May Alvarez strode in, carrying a large bundle of damp, smudged newspapers. "Judge Crowley," May announced, her voice dripping with dry sarcasm. "Fancy meeting you here. I see you're sending out reports of the riot. Good thing I brought my own." May slammed the bundle onto the counter. It was a special, hastily printed edition of the Red Mesa Register. This edition contained a full-length, meticulously researched investigative report. May had used her contacts from her days running a saloon near the cattle trails. The article featured interviews with several independent drovers and small-time ranchers from neighboring territories who confirmed they had been systematically driven off their land and denied water access by Crowley, even before the barbed wire law was strictly legal. May had essentially created a body of witness testimony. "I'm sending this report to every paper between here and Flagstaff. Judge, May declared. And I've reserved the wire for the next 2 hours to send out excerpts to my regional contacts, a full, truthful account of your land grabs. If you send that lying telegram, it will cross the wire at the same time as my sworn witness accounts. Do you really want the county seat to have to choose between your word and a dozen honest, independent ranchers? Crowley was trapped. He could not send the telegram without drawing intense, immediate scrutiny to his entire operation. He glared at May, seeing a formidable opponent in the savvy saloon owner. Back at the schoolhouse, Boone returned, having secured the Reverend's moral wavering. Evelyn was still hovering over the resignation letter, the guilt heavy on her shoulders. "Did you finish it?" Boone asked gently, sitting down on the bench across from her. "I can't stay, Boone," she whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. "I've turned the children's sanctuary into a firing line. The gossip, it is ruining my position, making me a scandal. They won't listen to me if they think I'm a loose woman." "They listened to you at the fair," Boone reminded her. "They signed the paper, not because you were respectable, but because you were right and because you were brave enough to stand on that stage." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, heavy pistol, a solid, well-cared-for piece of craftsmanship. He placed it on the desk, along with a box of dull, tarnished brass cartridges. "I need your help, Miss Hart," Boone said. "I need you to practice. Not shooting men, just using the tool." Evelyn looked at the pistol, then back at Boone, confused. "I don't want to learn to kill anyone." "It's not loaded with live rounds," Boone assured her, picking up the box of cartridges. "See these? They're just primers. They make a sharp click noise, a shock, but they won't fire a bullet. They're for practice to get the rhythm, the feel, the steadiness. A man in the fight needs to know the woman he is protecting has a solid hand, in case he's down." He began teaching her the mechanics, how to grip the handle, how to pull the hammer back, how to align the sight. "It's about control, Evelyn," he said, using her first name deliberately, quietly, shifting their relationship once more into a partnership. "You control the moment. You control the fear. You do it like dictation, slow, steady, one letter at a time." Evelyn, still numb from the gossip, found the metallic coolness of the pistol oddly grounding. She followed his instructions, raising the heavy weapon, taking a breath. She aimed at a rusty, dented kettle hanging by the stove, a perfect target. She squeezed the trigger. Click! A loud, startling noise, but nothing more. "Too fast, too shaky," Boone critiqued gently. "Your mind is on the gossip, not the target. Try again. You are aiming at the reputation Crowley is trying to pin on you. Hit the lie." Evelyn took a deep, steadying breath. She raised the pistol again, focusing all her fear and anger into a single point. She pulled the trigger slowly, deliberately. Click! The shot was clean. The noise made her jump, but when she looked, the kettle was still hanging there. "You missed," Boone chuckled. "No, I didn't," Evelyn retorted, a flash of her old self returning. She suddenly felt a burst of irreverent, wild humor. She recocked the hammer, took quick aim, and deliberately fired at the thin metal string holding the kettle. Click! The string broke cleanly. The kettle crashed to the floor with a magnificent, echoing clang. Evelyn stared at the smoking gun, then at the fallen kettle, and then at Boone. A wide, exhausted smile spread across her face. Boone threw back his head and laughed, a full-throated, joyful sound that banished the shadows and the dust. "Well, I'll be," Boone said, wiping his eye. "You just shot your dinner, but I'll admit that was a damn fine sight." "If I had a grade for that, I think I'd pass," Evelyn replied, still breathing hard, the laughter shaking her shoulders. "In this country, who teaches whom doesn't matter, as long as you learn together," Boone said, his gaze warm and steady. The moment of shared humor was a balm, dissolving the shame. Evelyn crumbled the resignation letter in her hand and threw it into the stove. She sat down and wrote a short, honest letter to her mother in Missouri. "I will not be coming home. I will stay. I will teach the children how to read and how to be brave." The conflict was accelerating towards a violent head. Boone, whose vigilance was now absolute, received a coded message tucked into his saddle roll. It was from Titus, a man Boone had once ridden with years ago. Now a low-level member of Crowley's Crows, but also an old friend. The note was brief and desperate: railroad payroll due Tuesday. Crowley setting up another mail theft. Planning to use it to frame B needs a public tragedy to finish the school fight. One of us is ready to talk if you can guarantee protection. This was the knot, the final stage of the rising action. Crowley was not only going to stage a train robbery this time. The lucrative railroad payroll was the target, but he was going to make sure Boone was definitively framed for it, using the chaos to destroy the entire community support for the school. Boone looked at the small piece of paper, then out at the schoolhouse, where Evelyn was preparing lessons for the evening class. He knew the risks. He had a potential informant, a man who could expose the entire conspiracy. But exposing Crowley meant stepping directly into the path of a violent, armed confrontation. Boone knew he had to meet Titus. The time for running, or even gentle resistance, was over. He was no longer a drifter. He was Red Mesa's protector. He would use the informant to turn Crowley's final, violent trap back on the judge. But he would need Evelyn's composure and the community's newfound courage to pull it off. The evening following the sandstorm and the crisis of the wall sheet was a rare moment of stillness. The wind had finally dropped to a gentle sigh, the kind of quiet that follows a fever. Above Red Mesa, the sky had been washed clean. The stars scattered across the vast black canvas in brilliant, cold profusion. A scent of damp earth mixed with the sharp, clean aroma of sagebrush or XO Tom wafted in from the hills. Evelyn and Boone sat by a small, contained fire pit Boone had dug near the back of the schoolhouse. It was a utilitarian fire, meant for boiling coffee and warding off the high desert chill. But it cast a soft, warm glow that seemed to push back the fear and the gossip. Boone was working on repairing a worn saddle strap, and Evelyn watched the efficient movements of his hands. They were quiet hands, capable of everything from firing a rifle with surgical precision to gently hammering a roofing nail. "You need to know how to manage a horse with one hand, Evelyn," Boone said, breaking the silence without looking up. "In case you're carrying water, or holding a paper, or dealing with trouble." He picked up a coil of thin, pliable leather and began to demonstrate, showing her how to loop the reins securely and maintain tension with a single hand, using the grip of the thumb and forefinger for steering. Evelyn leaned closer, trying to follow the intricate movements. "It's all so much practice. Everything you do, the shooting, the riding, the silent standing up to Murdoch, it all looks effortless, but it's years of practice." "Years of necessity," Boone corrected, giving her the reins. "Now, try that. Easy on the pressure. Let the horse feel the instruction, not the command." As Evelyn fumbled with the leather, the close, quiet intimacy of the moment made her vulnerable. The sight of Boone, relaxed but intensely focused, the firelight highlighting the severe, attractive planes of his face, eased away her usual defenses. She thought of the ease with which he had laughed when she broke the kettle, and the absolute certainty with which he had stood against Crowley's power. She knew she had fallen for him, and that knowledge brought the old, familiar terror. She finished the knot, and it was clumsy. She didn't look at the knot, she looked at the fire. "I'm clumsy at this," Evelyn admitted, her voice barely a whisper, a confession of fear more than a comment on her writing skills. "At everything that requires natural grace. My whole life. I've been reading books, following rules, trying to be the respectable woman who never makes a mistake." She took a shaky breath, the conversation shifting from leather reins to the reins of her own life. "And that includes affection, intimacy." She continued, struggling with the words, her face hot. "I haven't had much experience with it. I've never been courted properly, and I've never..." Never kissed a man." She looked up at Boone, her eyes wide, searching his face for judgment, for the faint sign of the ridicule she was always afraid of. "It's not that I'm opposed, it's that I'm afraid of being clumsy. I'm afraid I'll do it wrong, or that the person will see how truly ignorant I am of all of that. I've always been afraid of being judged for doing anything that isn't written down in a textbook." Boone Calder stopped working entirely. He gently placed the leather down and turned his body fully toward her, his posture conveying total, unreserved attention. He didn't laugh, didn't patronize, and didn't show any sign of surprise. His expression was one of profound understanding and respect. He reached out a large hand, palm up, and waited. Evelyn, almost without thinking, placed her small, cool hand in his. His grasp was warm, comforting, and steady. "Evelyn," he said softly, using her name like a promise. "There are no rules for two people. There are no laws here except the ones we make ourselves." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a feather-light kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. The simple, deliberate act was electric, a declaration of intent built entirely on respect. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her breath catching in her throat, the heat from the fire and the heat from their shared closeness merging. She felt the shyness and the fear, but for the first time, the desire to trust eclipsed the fear of failing. She closed the distance between them, her voice a near silent plea, a vulnerable whisper of absolute honesty. Virgin said, "I don't know how to kiss." Boone smiled then, a genuine soft curve of the lips that chased the shadows from his eyes, making them look impossibly kind. His voice, usually so curt and gravelly, was warm, deep, and comforting, a low promise delivered under the immense, indifferent sprawl of the desert sky. The cowboy smiled softly. "Then we'll practice all night, forever." He lifted his hand, not to pull her in, but to gently cup the side of her face, his thumb lightly stroking her cheekbone, wiping away a smear of invisible dust. He paused, his eyes asking permission, giving her every chance to retreat. Evelyn did not retreat. She held his gaze, trembling slightly, a tremor he felt through her hand in his. Boone closed the final distance slowly, with exquisite care. It was a kiss of shared breath, a soft meeting of lips, a connection built on weeks of shared defense and growing trust. It was not a kiss of passion or speed, but of gentle recognition. He held the moment still, allowing her time to acclimate, to feel the fundamental rightness of it. When he felt the slight, involuntary tremor in her body, he immediately broke the contact, pulling back only far enough for their foreheads to touch, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. "When you want," he whispered, his eyes closed. "Only when you want, and only as much as you want." It was the boundary of consent defined not by law or custom, but by absolute, tender respect. It was the purest form of intimacy, non-physical and emotionally vast. Evelyn, leaning into the warmth of his steadying presence, felt her internal dam break. It wasn't clumsy, it wasn't wrong, and it was the furthest thing from the salacious rumor Crowley was trying to spread. It was simply real. She finally pulled back enough to meet his eyes. Her own face flushed, a shy, giddy smile replacing the terror. "If I had to grade that, I think I'd fail," Evelyn confessed, the nervousness making her witty. Too much hesitation, too much planning. Boone reached up and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "In this country, who teaches whom doesn't matter. Miss Hart, what matters is that we learn together. There is no failure in learning, only practice." They sat side by the cooling fire, their knees occasionally brushing, the new silence between them rich with unsaid understanding. "I won't leave Red Mesa," Evelyn promised, placing her hand firmly over his, not for the gossip, not for the threat of the auction, and not for the fear of being judged. "My honor is here, with the people who need this school." "Then I'm not leaving either," Boone affirmed, closing his hand over hers. "I ran from the wire once. I won't do it again. I'll stand guard, fix the roof, and make sure that map gets to the county assessor when the time comes." It was a simple, profound exchange of vows, a quiet promise that bound them not just to each other, but to the community and the fight. No man left behind, and no good cause abandoned. Boone then spoke of his past, revealing the full shape of his wanderlust. "I was set to marry a girl in Texas, a good, strong woman, but her father owned the biggest ranch there. He didn't want me, an average cowhand, to marry into his family unless I agreed to become his foreman, which meant using the barbed wire to close off the common roots, just like Crowley is doing." I saw the look in his eyes, the same look I see in the judge. I knew I couldn't trade my soul for a marriage certificate, so I left her a letter and rode out. It was easier to live as a loner than to betray my own truth. Evelyn understood. His constant movement wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It was about protecting a fiercely guarded moral core. He had been alone because he was decent. Evelyn, listening to his honest sacrifice, felt her own path crystallize. Virtue wasn't about being quiet and uncomplaining. It was about standing up, choosing the right side, and daring to love, even when that love made her a target. She had finally made the transition from the repressed Missouri girl to the fearless woman of the frontier. The two of them sat, feeling the fragile peace they had forged, unaware that just beyond the quiet darkness, the true danger was being set in place. 2 miles north of Red Mesa, near the newly laid railway line that was scheduled to carry the quarterly payroll, Crowley's crows were busy, led by Murdoch. They worked under the cover of the starry night. They planted heavy charges of black powder beneath the track, close to a sharp bend where the train would have no time to slow down. They weren't just planning a robbery. They were setting a trap designed to derail the entire train, creating the perfect, violent scene to pin on the armed bandit Boone Calder, silencing the support for the school forever. The peaceful night, filled with shared whispers and the tentative promises of new love, was being shadowed by the final, explosive threat. Boone's informant, Titus, had been right. The climax was set for the very next dawn. The quiet resolve of the previous night was shattered by a sound that echoed the very violence Boone and Evelyn were fighting against. It was still hours before dawn, the sky a deep, starless indigo. When the explosion hit, it came from the direction of the railway tracks, a massive, tearing roar that shook the very foundations of the schoolhouse and sent a shiver through the town. Evelyn scrambled out of her cot and found Boone already pulling on his boots, his face grim. "The payroll train," he stated, his voice tight. "Crowley didn't just want the money. He wanted the destruction." They rode out immediately. At the bend in the tracks, they found the scene of the chaos, the engine and the attached payroll car, armored but not immune to explosives, had been partially derailed. The blast was expertly placed. The cars were tilted precariously, and masked riders, the crows, were swarming the wreckage, already retrieving the boxes. They had done their work quickly and efficiently. Boone's eyes, however, were focused on the ground. The crows, wearing bandanas that concealed their faces but not their distinctive boots, had deliberately scuffed the dirt near the blast site. Mixed among their heavy heel plates were clear, deliberate drag marks, the exact kind of imprint that would be left by Boone's boots, complete with a distinctive, manufactured scuff that Boone did not actually have. It was a false flag, a carefully constructed piece of evidence designed to frame him beyond doubt. "They're not just robbing the train," Boone muttered, pulling Scout to a halt near a cluster of jagged rocks. "They're framing the man who stood up for the school." He spurred his horse and galloped away from the wreckage, not toward the crows, but toward a prearranged spot outside the town's perimeter, a quiet, isolated canyon known as Echo Alley. He met Titus there, the informant from the crows, a gaunt, nervous man who was already visibly trembling with fear and betrayal. Titus had brought with him 2 pieces of undeniable proof. "He promised me land." "Boone," Titus stammered, his eyes darting. "But he wants to kill people, not just fence them in. I drew the line when he started talking about the mine and the children. Titus handed Boone 2 items. The first was a small, tightly folded piece of paper, a carbon copy of a coded telegram Silas Crowley had sent the previous evening to a known fence in Silverton, detailing the exact time and location of the planned accidental derailment and pre-selling the contents. The second item was a crude, small map. "That's the layout for the ambush," Titus whispered, pointing to the map. "Crowley is going to let the crows grab the money. Then the county sheriff's men will unexpectedly show up and kill the ones who resist. He wants me to be one of the casualties, so I get the money and he gets the silence. I'm out. Boone, I need a clear path to the next county and a new name." Boone took the evidence, his hand firm. "You'll get it, Titus, now. Ride hard and don't stop." Boone Calder now had the full chain of evidence, the telegram proving conspiracy, the testimony proving intent, and the staged crime scene proving the frame. He had to use it to bring Crowley down permanently. As Boone rode back towards the wreckage, he heard the approaching sound of the crows, Murdoch's heavy voice leading them. They had finished retrieving the payroll boxes and were now sweeping the area to ensure the tracks were properly contaminated with Boone Calder's footprints. Boone, outnumbered and with no intention of killing, led them away from the wreckage and into the heart of Echo Alley, a labyrinth of red rock and narrow chasms. He was an expert marksman, and he knew how to use the terrain. He dismounted and wedged himself behind a high outcropping. When the crows entered the chasm, Boone fired 3 rapid warning shots into the rock walls. The sound, amplified and distorted by the narrow confines, multiplied into a cacophony of echoes, sounding like a dozen rifles opening fire. The crows, surprised and believing they had ridden into an ambush laid by the federal marshals, panicked and began firing wildly at the phantom sounds. Boone's strategy was pure distraction and confusion. He fired only to keep them disoriented, never aiming for the body, preserving his strict moral line against unnecessary bloodshed. While Boone occupied the bandits, Evelyn was executing her own crucial counterstrike in town. After the explosion, she immediately went to the church, gathering the handful of children who had already arrived for the day. Her presence was calm and steady, transforming the sanctuary into a temporary fortress. "We will stay here," Evelyn announced, helping Noah and the others push the heavy wooden pews into small barricades near the doors. "It is the safest building. We are not hiding. We are preparing. We will wait for Sheriff Gaines here." Reverend Hale, seeing Evelyn's quiet determination, finally shed the last of his deference to Crowley's power. He stood beside Evelyn at the makeshift barricade, a silent, powerful guardian of his flock. He saw that true faith required action, not just quiet prayer. But Evelyn knew the true danger wasn't at the church. It was at the telegraph office. She knew Crowley would use this moment of terror and chaos to send his final, damning telegram, officially nullifying the community's petition and confirming Boone's guilt to the county seat. She slipped out of the back of the church and raced toward the telegraph office. She arrived just as Murdoch, having broken away from the confusion in Echo Alley, rushed through the front door. He was covered in red dust and fury, his face contorted. He seized May Alvarez, who was already at the counter sending her next edition, dragging her roughly away from the key. "Get away from the wire, you old witch!" Murdoch roared, pulling his pistol and pointing it at May. "I'm sending the judge's dispatch. The bandit Calder just blew up the train. It's over for your little schoolmarm." May fought back with ferocity, scratching and kicking, but Murdoch was too strong. Evelyn, seeing the hostage situation, knew she couldn't rush the front. She quietly slipped around the back of the small wooden building. The telegraph wires, running on tall poles behind the office, were their only connection to the outside world. She climbed onto a stack of old shipping crates, reaching desperately for the thick cluster of black wires running into the back of the building. She needed a knife or a sharp tool, but she had only her bare hands. She grabbed the wire, her teeth gritted against the sting of the splinters, and pulled with all her strength, yanking the wire from its brittle ceramic insulator. Inside the office, Murdoch was violently forcing May away from the key. He reached out to grab the paper dispatch with the pre-written lie from Crowley. Just as his fingers closed around the document, the entire telegraph machine went suddenly, utterly silent. The clicking stopped. The circuit was dead. Murdoch turned, confused by the sudden electronic silence, momentarily distracted. That moment was all Boone needed. Boone, having scattered and disarmed the main body of crows in the alley, had raced back to town. Hearing the new noise and sensing the climax, was here. He burst through the front door of the telegraph office. Murdoch, surprised, swung his pistol up. "Calder!" Boone didn't fire. He launched himself across the counter in a blur of controlled motion. It wasn't a shooting, but a wrestling match. A fierce, close-quarters grappling designed to disarm, not to kill. Murdoch was stronger, but Boone was faster and more focused. They crashed against the far wall. Murdoch managed to slash out with his knife hand, catching Boone on the left forearm, a searing, painful wound, but Boone only grunted and locked his injured arm around Murdoch's wrist. Twisting with ferocious leverage, the pistol clattered harmlessly to the floor. With a final heave, Boone pinned Murdoch to the ground, pulling his arms behind his back and quickly securing them with a coil of the tough leather rope he always carried. He didn't use his gun. He used restraint and sheer physical will. Evelyn, rushing in from the back door, saw the blood soaking Boone's left sleeve. She also saw May, shaken but unharmed, grabbing the lying dispatch that had fallen to the floor. "He was trying to send this... Boone," May gasped, her voice trembling but triumphant. "Crowley's last lie." The conflict was finally over. The true climax wasn't a hail of bullets, but the accumulation of proof. Sheriff Gaines, having finally realized the depth of Crowley's conspiracy and spurred by the sight of the train wreckage, arrived with two of his most trusted deputies. May handed him the crucial evidence, the singed map proving the water access was public, the carbon copy of the telegram proving Crowley's conspiracy to derail the train, and Boone's fresh rope securing Murdoch, the lead crow, as the primary perpetrator. "He tried to kill me, Sheriff," Boone stated, his voice tight from the pain in his arm. "And he tried to silence May. Titus, the crow's own man, has already ridden out to the county seat with a sworn affidavit of conspiracy." Sheriff Gaines looked at the evidence, the smoking gun, the captured foreman, the wounded Boone, and the documents proving the theft of both water and the law. He had to choose between the law he swore to uphold and the powerful man who paid his bills. The sight of the wreckage and the injured Boone made the choice simple. "Murdoch, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted mail robbery, and attempted murder," Gaines announced, kicking the discarded pistol away. He then sent two men immediately to Judge Crowley's ranch with a warrant for temporary arrest and a subpoena to appear before the traveling county judge. The gunfire had ended. The danger had passed. The payroll was secured and recovered by the townsfolk who arrived to help. The people of Red Mesa, emerging from their homes, saw the captured Murdoch, the truth exposed, and the quiet, wounded cowboy standing beside their courageous schoolmarm. They cheered, not just for the recovered money, but for the community's integrity that had been saved. The school, the symbol of their struggle, had not been destroyed by the fire or the lie. Instead, the students and the reverend, standing side by side in the church, had become the moral center that allowed the truth to prevail. The fight for the water and the land was won, not with violence, but with community, courage, and a cowboy's unwavering commitment to the truth. The aftermath of the train derailment and the subsequent exposure of Silas Crowley's conspiracy brought an immediate, necessary gravity to Red Mesa. Within 2 days, the circuit judge, traveling from Silverton, arrived to hold an emergency summary hearing. Since the county courthouse was far, the hearing was held in Red Mesa itself, in the largest available building, the Yellow Cactus Saloon. It was a field courtroom, harsh and unforgiving, illuminated by dust-filtered sunlight streaming through the windows and the sober faces of the townsfolk packed into the room. Crowley, flanked by 2 solemn deputies, sat at a table, stripped of his magisterial authority. his face a landscape of pinched fury and self-pity. The prosecution presented the evidence, the telegram of conspiracy. Titus's affidavit detailing the setup, the recovered payroll, and the physical evidence of the planted explosives at the rail bend. The heart of the trial, however, belonged to the community. One by one, the witnesses came forward, a diverse tapestry of frontier life that Crowley had dismissed and scorned. There was the Irish miner, Patrick O'Malley, testifying about Crowley's practice of restricting access to common waterholes, forcing higher prices on the miners' camp. Then came the Mexican laborers from the rail yard, their testimony translated by May Alvarez, confirming that Crowley had leveraged their lack of legal knowledge to force them into giving up grazing rights near the riverbed. Finally, a small, composed group of Navajo elders spoke quietly, using Evelyn as their interpreter, describing how Crowley's first barbed wire fences had blocked ancient migration and water routes, disrupting their traditional lives. The judge listened, impassive and serious. The most powerful testimony came from Reverend Hale. The Reverend stood before his community, shedding his earlier fear and equivocation entirely. His voice, usually hesitant, rang out with moral certainty. I stood silent, or worse, I supported the oppression of this man. Reverend Hale declared, looking not at the judge, but at Evelyn and Boone. I allowed myself to be bullied by threats of financial ruin, thinking that faith required a quiet life. But true faith does not underwrite injustice. We saw the true face of greed, and we chose to stand with the vulnerable, led by this brave schoolmarm and this cowboy. Judge Crowley used the law to steal the lifeblood of this town, the water and the soul of this town, the school. The crowd erupted in murmured approval. The moral tide had fully turned. The community had purged its fear and its prejudice. The judge's decision was swift and decisive. Silas Crowley was formally stripped of his Justice of the Peace title and placed under provisional arrest to await formal trial at the county seat on charges of conspiracy, mail robbery, and abuse of public office. Crucially, the judge made two immediate rulings regarding the town's lifeblood. First, he legally suspended all claims of ownership Crowley had asserted over the critical water spring, designating the source as a permanent public resource. A formal, permanent public access trail was immediately established, forever protecting the town's right to water. Second, the planned auction of the school land was canceled permanently. The judge ruled that the land, having been demonstrated as the center of community defense and education, was vital to public interest and granted an indefinite stay against all attempts to seize or foreclose upon it. The sentence on the day was symbolic but profound. Crowley's massive cache of newly purchased barbed wire, which he had intended to use to choke off the entire territory, was officially confiscated. The judge ordered that the wire be melted down and reforged by the town blacksmith into something useful for the community that Crowley had tried to destroy. The social healing began immediately. The very next Saturday was designated School Raising Day, an old frontier tradition where the entire community gathered to build or repair a communal structure. It wasn't just a repair, it was a profound act of social mending. The object of the day was to finish the drainage channel, replace the damaged tin roof, and, most importantly, add a small, proper kitchen and an extra storage room to the schoolhouse, a commitment to Evelyn's expanded vision of community education. Boone, whose left forearm was now tightly wrapped in a bandage from his knife wound, was the undisputed foreman. He was a natural leader, not by shouting, but by quiet competence. He directed the placement of the heavy timber trusses and the placement of the roofing tin, his directions minimal, clear, and focused. The Irish miners, accustomed to handling heavy tools, worked the rafters. The Mexican workers, skilled with adobe and mortar, built the foundation for the new kitchen hearth. The women, laughing and chatting, provided a stream of food and water, keeping the crews energized. Evelyn, no longer shy or ashamed, was the quartermaster and the morale officer. She managed the supply lists, supervised the children who acted as water carriers and messengers, and moved through the crowd with a confident grace she had never possessed in Missouri. The internal conflict that had plagued her, the fear of scandal, the desire to be respectable, was gone. Boone's simple declaration of honor, that true decency meant protecting the vulnerable, had set her free. The gossip, now exposed as a tool of Crowley's malice, held no power over her. She was loved, she was respected, and she was fighting on the right side. Her personal turmoil had been resolved by community action. Boone, watching Evelyn direct the work with such easy confidence, felt his own internal knot loosen. He was no longer the wandering cowhand running from a choice made years ago. Here, he was needed, he was valued, and he belonged. The commitment he had made to Evelyn not to leave the town, the school, or her was now a commitment to the very ground beneath his feet. He had stopped running. At midday, they gathered for the communal lunch. It was a boisterous, happy affair, served on makeshift tables under the newly installed awning. The women had contributed stews, bread, and beans, vast quantities of beans. Boone tasted the beans from the communal pot and gave a theatrical grimace. "Well," he declared, his eyes twinkling as he looked at the women who had cooked, "these are robust." "They're a little salty, Mr. Calder," Evelyn admitted, trying a spoonful. "I think Mrs. Foster might have dropped the whole container in." "Salty," Boone countered, leaning in with a conspiratorial whisper to the miners at his table. "No, ma'am. These beans are flavored by the tears of yesterday. They taste of the bitterness of the sandstorm and the shame of a man trying to steal a town. That's why they're so bracing." A roar of laughter went up from the entire table. The tension of the past weeks, the fear of the fire and the shooting, evaporated in that moment of shared, rough humor. The drama was over, and the enduring reality of frontier life, sweat, beans, and wry wit had returned. The final, tangible symbol of their victory came 2 weeks later. The town blacksmith, an old man named Jedediah, had finished his work. He had taken the thick industrial strands of Crowley's confiscated barbed wire, the symbol of greed and exclusion, and fed it into his forge. He worked for days, heating, hammering, and purifying the metal. The result was a beautiful, small brass bell, cast from the purified metal of the fence. On a quiet afternoon, Boone and Evelyn stood together as the finished bell was hoisted into the belfry of the schoolhouse. It was simple, perfectly formed, and utterly significant. Evelyn, wearing her best dress, took the rope and pulled it once, her movements slow and deliberate. The sound that rang out over Red Mesa was startlingly pure and clear, high-pitched and resonant, like the trickle of clean water running over smooth stone. It was the antithesis of the harsh, cutting wire from which it was made. Boone stood beside her, his arm still bandaged, his expression solemn. "The Crowley bell," Boone murmured, tilting his head to listen to the final, lingering echo. "It sounds like the spring water," Evelyn observed, tears pricking her eyes. "Clean and necessary." The bell, born from the material of hatred, now rang out the clear, transparent sound of community justice and education. It was a tangible reminder that good could be forged from the basest materials, and that the town had chosen to build a future, not to perpetuate a feud. Boone knew then that he would never leave. His wandering heart had found its permanent home, tethered by a moral fight and the gentle authority of a schoolmarm. The sound of the bell was the sound of his own internal conflict finally coming to rest. The drought that had defined Red Mesa for months finally broke. It arrived not with a sudden downpour, but with a series of low, gray clouds that wept steadily over the desert. It was the first proper soaking rain of the season, and the dry earth drank deeply. The rain provided an immediate, vital testament to Boone's foresight. The wide, deep drainage channels he had dug around the schoolhouse during the heat of the conflict, the work that had directly undermined Crowley's claims of an unstable building, now channeled the runoff perfectly. The school's foundation remained dry and secure. while the excess water flowed past the new public easement and into the thirsty land. The children, unused to such a gentle, persistent deluge, rushed out, shrieking with delight, holding out their hands to feel the cool, clean water. The earth smelled new and alive. This rain brought not just water, but a heartwarming twist of fate. A few days after the downpour, a frail, elderly woman named Widow Ramirez, a quiet, long-time resident who lived in a small, well-kept adobe house just down the road, passed away. Her lawyer, during the reading of her will, announced a final, poignant bequest. Widow Ramirez owned a small, fertile patch of land adjacent to the school lot, one of the few pieces that had consistently yielded a small garden despite the drought. She had bequeathed the land directly to the Red Mesa School Fund. Attached to the deed was a simple, handwritten note for the children who once were thirsty, that they may learn to grow. It was a profound gesture of community faith, turning a small, private piece of life into a public hope, a garden for the students, a place where Evelyn could teach not just books, but life and growth. The widow Ramirez had chosen to invest her legacy not in profit, but in the future, cementing the school's place in the town forever. Meanwhile, Boone was forced to confront the long shadow of his past. A letter arrived for him at May Alvarez's saloon, forwarded from his last known posting in Texas. It bore the heavy seal of the immense cattle ranch he had once worked for, the very place he had left years ago to avoid becoming a tool of oppression. The letter was apologetic, detailing how the ranch owner, now old and ailing, regretted his past abuses of power and his attempts to force Boone to string barbed wire against smaller ranchers. The letter ended with a sincere offer they needed an honest man to manage the vast operations, a man they knew wouldn't steal or use brute force. They offered him the position of general foreman, a prestigious, high-paying job, and the kind of security Boone had never known. Boone sat by the fire, reading the letter until the paper was soft and warm in his hands. It was the very life he had rejected, now offered back to him free of the moral taint that had driven him away. It was a tempting proposition: safety, wealth, and an honest chance to manage a major operation. He walked to the schoolhouse. Evelyn was in the new annex, organizing the donated materials for the kitchen. "They want me back," Boone said simply, handing her the letter. "The Texas ranch, general foreman, it's a clean slate. I can finally afford to send you back to Missouri to buy all the books you want." Evelyn read the letter, her expression unreadable. She handed it back without comment, then turned her attention to sorting a box of nails. "And what about Red Mesa?" she asked quietly. "It will survive. The water is safe, the school is safe," Boone said, running a hand through his hair. He was struggling with the decision, with the final pull of the open road versus the steady, quiet anchor of this town. "I could finally be something respectable. Not a gunslinger, not a drifter." Evelyn finally looked at him, her eyes steady. "Boone, you were never a gunslinger, and you are the most respectable man I have ever known. Respect is earned by what you choose to protect, not by the size of the ranch you manage. That ranch needs your honesty, but Red Mesa needs your heart, and I need the man who fixed my roof and taught me to shoot kettles. I need the man who stays." Boone Calder crumpled the letter slowly in his hand, the paper protesting with a dry crunch. He knew she was right. His purpose wasn't a job title. It was this place, this fight, and this woman. "I'm not going," Boone said, the words a simple statement of absolute fact. Red Mesa is home. As Boone made his choice, Evelyn completed her own arc of growth. The school was preparing for a small, unofficial commencement for the parents, a celebration of the new annex and the widow Ramirez's garden plot. Evelyn was scheduled to give a speech appealing for donations to a new library fund. She was no longer the nervous, easily shamed woman from Missouri. The strength she had found in the fire, the fair, and the fight with Crowley had forged her into a compelling orator. Standing before the assembled families, a crowd that included minors, Navajo families, Mexican migrants, and the town council she spoke not with notes, but with genuine passion. Her voice was strong, fluent, and graced with a natural charm she had discovered in the crucible of conflict. "We have protected this land because it gives us water," Evelyn declared, holding up a small, empty cup. "But we need more than just water in the ground. We need knowledge in the mind. The most dangerous drought is the one of ignorance. Give us your help. Give us the means to fill these walls with books, so our children, and all of us, can read the law better than the men who try to pervert it." She was captivating. She no longer sought to avoid the gaze of the crowd. She commanded it. She had fully realized that her virtue was her voice, not her silence. The reprieve, however, was about to be savagely interrupted. Crowley, incarcerated and stripped of his power, was not finished, even from his temporary cell at the sheriff's office, awaiting transport to the county seat. He managed to send a desperate message to an old mercenary contact. Crowley had hired a gunman, Harlan Pike, a notorious enforcer known for his ruthlessness and silence, to pay Red Mesa a final, violent visit. Pike's objective was simple: clean up the Boone-Calder problem before Crowley's trial could be contaminated by a final. Public witness. Pike arrived late that afternoon. A lean, anonymous man with cold eyes and a distinct lack of fanfare. The attack was planned for the evening of the school's dedication of the new annex, the moment Boone would be most exposed, guarding Evelyn. The dedication was a quiet, celebratory affair. As the people were finishing a simple, shared supper inside the new kitchen, the light rain began again, a soft, misty drizzle that turned the evening air cool and clean. Boone stood on the porch, his rifle casually tucked near the door, a silent sentry. Suddenly, a movement from the dark. Wet shadows near the widow Ramirez's new garden plot. Harlan Pike stepped into the pale yellow light spilling from the school windows, a long-barreled rifle raised and aimed at Boone. "Calder!" Pike called out, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of emotion. "Crowley sends his final regrets." Boone didn't have time to draw his rifle properly. He saw the flash of intent and knew this was not a warning. Pike was here to kill. "Evelyn down!" Boone roared, shoving himself sideways and throwing his body across the threshold to shield Evelyn, who was standing just inside the doorway. Pike fired. The shot was muffled by the damp air, but the impact was still brutal. It struck the wooden door frame, sending a shower of splinters and lead fragments flying. Boone felt a searing pain, not the direct hit of a bullet, but a tearing, deep graze across his right shoulder, a near miss that left him momentarily stunned and bleeding profusely. But he was alive, and Evelyn was safe behind him. The commotion inside was immediate. The men Daniel Foster, Patrick O'Malley, and even Reverend Hale didn't scatter. They reacted with the disciplined courage they had learned during the train crisis. They spilled out of the door, not armed with rifles, but with the heavy, crude tools of their trades: an axe handle, a shovel, and the very wooden beam Boone had directed them to place over the new porch. Sheriff Gaines, who was among the guests, acted instantly. He drew his pistol and fired a shot into the air, yelling for Pike to drop his weapon. Pike, the mercenary, was built for single combat, not community warfare. He was instantly surrounded by a wave of furious, determined citizens who were no longer afraid of violence. They were defending their community, their school, and their friend. Trapped, outflanked, and facing the combined wrath of a unified town. Harlan Pike was overwhelmed. The sheriff and the men disarmed him without another shot fired, bringing him down in the new mud of the schoolyard. The heart of the entire narrative theme was confirmed in that wet, chaotic moment. No one had died. Justice had prevailed not through Boone's superior marksmanship, but through the collective action and the discipline of the community. They had won with a shovel and a unified front, choosing self-defense and law over vengeance. Boone sat on the porch step, leaning against the sturdy frame he had worked to build, breathing hard. Evelyn, her face pale with terror, was kneeling beside him, pressing a clean cloth to his bleeding shoulder. Noah, who had witnessed the entire scene from the kitchen window, rushed out, his eyes wide. "Miss Hart!" Noah exclaimed, pointing from Boone's wound to the broken kettle Evelyn had shot weeks ago. "You shot the kettle good. You should have shot the bad guy's hat." Evelyn, still shaking, couldn't help but laugh, a relieved, slightly hysterical sound. The comment was so perfectly absurd and grounded in their everyday reality. She felt the blood rush back to her cheeks. "I can't shoot people, Noah," Evelyn said, adjusting the bandage, her cheeks flushing pink. "But you shoot thieves' hats good," Noah insisted. "Maybe you are a practiced co-teacher of shooting hats." Boone, though wincing from the movement, looked at Evelyn with profound love and amusement. "He's right, Evelyn," Boone managed, his voice raspy. "My co-teacher of practical application. I handle the heavy lifting. You handle the aim." Evelyn looked at Boone, his sacrifice, his commitment, and the simple truth of the life they had built together. She knew then that Boone had given up his life on the run for her, and in doing so, had finally found his home. The final, violent shadow had passed, and all that remained was the promise of their shared future. The sun rose on the day of the Red Mesa schoolhouse dedication, not with the harsh glare of recent months, but with a warm, steady light. The rain had settled the dust, and the air was miraculously clean. This was more than a ceremony. It was a testament to survival, an affirmation that decency could defeat ruthlessness. The small gathering was held on the newly finished porch. The additions, the stable kitchen annex, the reinforced roof, the dry foundation spoke of enduring commitment. The small plot of Widow Ramirez's land, the Vuan Hoc, or learning garden, was already being turned over, the dark, damp soil promising growth. And high above, the new bell, cast from the melted, purified barbed wire, stood silent and gleaming. Evelyn, wearing her simple, best dress, stood at the small podium Boone had built. She looked out at the community, the townsfolk, the miners, the Navajo, the Mexican families, all standing together, shoulder to shoulder. Her shyness was a forgotten relic. She was poised, powerful, and deeply sincere. She reached out and placed a hand on the cool metal of the Crowley bell before she began to speak. "We stand here today, not to celebrate a building, but to celebrate a truth," Evelyn began, her voice clear and strong. "We learned that the law is not what is written, but what we choose to defend. We learned that the wealth of Red Mesa is not in the copper or the cattle, but in the hands of the people who worked here to build this, and the children who will learn here." She paused, looking at the children sitting cross-legged at the front, Noah in the first row. "Let this bell ring out the promise of this place," she concluded, her voice gaining emotional depth. "This school is open to every child. We will not ask the color of their skin. We will only ask the measure of their dream." A murmur of heartfelt affirmation swept through the crowd. This was the vision that had triumphed over Silas Crowley's greed. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to socialize, Boone walked over to Evelyn. He had his right arm, the one grazed by Harlan Pike's bullet, in a sling, a temporary inconvenience that only highlighted his commitment. Boone was holding something in his uninjured left hand. It was a single, thick set of reins, hand-braided from the finest, darkest leather, intricately knotted into a pattern of strength and beauty. It was a drover's gift, a symbol of control and partnership. He took Evelyn's hand, placing the soft, cool leather of the reins in her palm. "This is a lead rein," Boone murmured, his gaze steady and deep. "It's built for guidance, for setting the course and holding steady. I built it to guide a life. If you want, Evelyn, we can stop drifting now. We can be tethered right here." Evelyn felt the sincerity of his offer, the profound weight of a man who had prized his freedom above all else, choosing to give it up for her and the life they shared. "I want that, Boone," she whispered, her eyes shining. "More than anything, I want to build a life on this ground." Boone reached into the breast pocket of his coat. He was still the careful cowhand, the man who used only what he needed, and his choice of engagement ring reflected that. It was not a grand diamond. It was a simple, polished brass casing from a rifle cartridge, meticulously cleaned and buffed to a dull, honest shine. He had used a small, sharp tool to scratch 2 letters onto the side of the casing, an elegant E and a block B, intertwined. In the midst of the bustling, happy crowd, Boone Calder knelt on one knee on the new wooden porch, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, his eyes fixed only on Evelyn. He held up the simple, shining shell casing. "Evelyn Hart," Boone said, his voice husky with emotion and entirely without apology for the lack of extravagance. "This life we built, it almost killed us. But it saved us too. We have this house, this classroom, this town, and we have each other. Will you be the one I hold steady, the one I stay with, the one who makes this home, this school, and us, permanent?" Evelyn's breath hitched. She looked at the ring, the bullet casing, a symbol of the violence they had overcome, now polished into a promise of eternal partnership. It represented everything: the fight, the truth, the simplicity of their love. She dropped the leather reins and reached for his face, her hands cupping his cheeks. She didn't need words. She simply nodded, a slow, certain movement of complete commitment. At that exact moment, one of the children, celebrating the completion of the ceremony, ran to the bell rope and gave it a triumphant tug. The Crowley bell rang out over the town, its clear, pure tone sounding like the sweetest music. Boone rose, and in the sound of the bell, he kissed her. It was a kiss of absolute certainty, a kiss of profound respect, warm and unwavering, sealing their promise in the midst of their community. It was the opposite of the nervous, tentative kiss they had shared under the stars. This was the kiss of 2 people who had faced down death together and chosen a difficult, beautiful life. The future of Red Mesa began to take shape immediately. The school raising day was formalized into a yearly tradition. Evelyn and her growing band of student volunteers established the garden plot, teaching lessons on crop rotation and water conservation. The first harvest was planned for the autumn. The new annex officially hosted a thriving book club and the popular free night classes for adults. Boone, now officially a community asset rather than a drifter, began teaching practical courses: responsible horsemanship, basic surveying and trail marking, and reading the signs, a class on tracking and safety that doubled as a lesson in reading human character. He was known as the practical co-teacher, the one who enforced simple, clear rules of conduct and care. The final word on the villains was delivered swiftly. Silas Crowley was convicted at the county seat. His remaining lands were mostly confiscated to pay restitution, primarily establishing a large, permanent public water fund for the Red Mesa community. Harlan Pike, the hired gunman, was sentenced to a long term of hard labor in a territorial prison, effectively banished from the territory. The small community had defeated the ambition of possession with love, discipline, and shared courage. As the day waned, the sky turned a deep, impossible red, the color of the mesas and the town's namesake. It was the perfect, final backdrop to their victory. Evelyn walked out onto the porch after the last guest had left and rang the Crowley bell one final time, a sound of peaceful closure. Boone, now standing beside her, gently draped his coat over her shoulders. She leaned into the warmth of the worn leather, the familiar scent of wood smoke and sagebrush. "So, co-teacher," Boone teased, his voice low in her ear, his lips brushing the edge of her hair. "Tonight, are we going to practice writing letters, or are we going to practice kissing?" Evelyn smiled, turning in his arms, her eyes full of light and mischief. "Both," she replied, her voice soft but firm. But slowly. The final, lasting peace settled over the small town. In Red Mesa, the water ran cool again, and so did the hearts of the people. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Please comment below and let us know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts on the endurance of hope and love on the frontier. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.